So hello everyone, welcome to the third lesson and of course the third video lecture presentation for your facilitating learner-centered teaching. And this lesson is particularly revolving around the dimensions of learner-centered teaching, alright? So we'll get to see what are those as we go through. And lesson objectives to guide us through this particular lesson are, of course, you have to understand the focus of teacher-centered and learner-centered in the different domains of a learning environment. And you are also expected to assess compliance of teacher-made activities to learner-centeredness. And finally, you are to give highlights of learning on the 5 dimensions of learner-centered teaching. So by and by, we shall have all these objectives materialized as we unveil and unlock the dimensions as placed in your introduction or in the title of the lesson. So the first dimension of learner-centered teaching is on its content and functions. So these, by the way, and the next to follow are according to Blumberg of 2009 and Weimer of 2013. So Per Blumberg 2009 puts it this way: instructor-centered approaches focus on building a large knowledge base, perhaps at the expense of the learner's ability to use it or to engage in a meaningful way with the content. In other words, instructors cover the content and construct tests to measure students' retention. That's according to Weimer 2013. So let's focus on what Blumberg has just told. Well, we can't deny the fact that instructor-centered teaching or approach is really centered on making the learners receive knowledge, those that are coming from the teachers, or perhaps those that are inscribed in books. And there's really no facilitation of how far the learning can go in this type of instruction approach. Meaning to say, the learners, after receiving or after perhaps having retained some of the concepts, are no longer facilitated or led to something in which they could apply at least what they have learned. And in support to that of Blumberg, Weimer here puts it in a simple term, and it says that what instructors look after content and its functions is that the learners are to be measured. Remember perennialism, are to be measured of how much they have retained, how much they have memorized, and not really about how much they really have learned and practically would be able to apply from all those that they have received from the teacher. So that is the first dimension. The focus, again, in simplest terms, possibly for you to understand, is that what's important here is the number or the quantity, all right, of content you could possibly grasp as a learner and the teachers could possibly offer, and not really about the quality of it. All right, there's no measure of how effective or how efficient the learning is when it comes to application, because that is not the focus. It's particularly on content alone and the retention and reception of it among learners. All right. Next dimension is the role of the teacher. So we'll see who is the teacher in this type of learning approach. So the learner-centered classroom involves changes. Look at this. There's an emphasis on the change in the roles and responsibilities of learners and instructors. Where? Of course, in the delivery of instructional strategies and in the learning per se or itself. So these all differ from those in the traditional teacher-centered classroom. Of course, when we looked into the paradigm shift, you know for a fact that teacher-centered teaching and learner-centered teaching actually have extreme nature or characteristic. All right, so in the learner-centered classroom, the learner requires individualization. All right, and there are also interactions and integration. What about individualization? Well, this ensures that learners are empowered to create their own activities and select their own authentic materials. So where is the teacher in this type of picture? Or in this type of a learning environment, how is the teacher? Where would we see the teacher? What are the responsibilities and the roles expected from teachers? When it is put this way, that the creation and the choosing of activities and even the materials are actually rooting out from the learners themselves. All right, don't forget that still the teacher is there, only that there is already a limitation to the job or to the role. He is actually just there to facilitate, all right, to guide. So learners interact through team learning and by teaching each other. So knowledge is no longer just expected flowing from the teacher or coming from the books that the teacher refers to, but learning can actually happen because there are many heads in the classroom. There are various background knowledge that each one in the classroom brings, and that all these people could share and link in to a wide variety of learning. All right. So during the learning process then, learners integrate what they have learned with prior learning and construct new meaning. All right. So remember constructivism. There is already a relation or a reproduction of meaning and even new learnings, because learners in this would try to mix in, blend, and even make use of prior and even present learnings in effect. And that's according to Maffei and Wagner in 1992. So if you look therefore in a learner-centered classroom, the lifeblood of the class is actually in the hands of the learners or in the heads of the learners. Both in the heads and the hands, you know, because learner-centered classroom would advocate really the involvement. And of course, you have to remember, learning becomes more meaningful when the hands become messy, or in other words, when the learners are involved. And so the role of the teacher is basically just a facilitator of learning. All right. So instructors again. So here are other roles that we could see from a teacher using learner-centered teaching. All right. First, the instructors must consider, of course, the following. First is the recognition and accommodation of different learning modalities. Of course, with respect to the individual differences of learners and even learning styles, this really has to be given emphasis. As early on, teachers have to devise or even adopt various modalities and consider them in classroom whenever possible or whenever the learning competency requires them so. Another would be provide structure without being overly directive. Of course, there should still be rules in the class, but and even, you know, systems that the learners have to follow through. Though it's learner-centered, but there still has to be rules set not only by the teacher, but of course, open to the suggestions of the learners as early as the start of the class or even the school year. So that in that way, there's freedom and there's no sense of being demanding, not being overly directive. Okay? Third is listen to and respect each learner's point of view. We can't avoid the fact that because of different perspectives about an issue, about a topic, we really would get along, or encounter, all right, opinions or even ideas that are sometimes off tangent or off the topic. But as teachers or as instructors in a learner-centered classroom, in order for us to maintain the confidence of our learners, even if they tend to make mistakes sometimes or to tell an erroneous statement, we still have to make a point that we welcome the idea and we recognize the good try, but we have other ways of telling that he or she can improve or restate or recast the statement to make it better. Something to that effect, all right? Of course, in that way, we avoid misleading and even multiplying errors as well. And the fourth is encourage and facilitate learners' shared decision making. Let's say, for example, if you were starting, like I have said a while ago, you have to already make it a point that rules and systems in the classroom are both your responsibility and the responsibility of each learner. And so you have to encourage their share of the decisions that you arrive at. Other than that, when group activities are given in the classroom or are required of from the students, then you have to make sure that as you roam around the classroom and do some monitoring of how the group is working, then encourage or at least tell the rest or put it in your criteria that participation or maximum participation from each group is encouraged or is a part of the grading, so that at least everybody in the group shares, all right? And in that way, it becomes collective. The effort becomes collective at the end of the task or the activity. That's just one of the many ways you can do it. Or there are actually available activities which really make use of certain roles, and everybody has to tell something. There's this kind of activity. I am just failing with the proper name, but it's kind of a circle, and every participant or every member of the class has a role to accomplish. So there's no way that the activity would be done and over without anyone in the group doing his or her role. And that's actually facilitating shared decision making at the end of the day. And the last, of course, to remember is that to help learners work through difficulties by asking open-ended questions to help them arrive at conclusions or solutions that are satisfactory to them. Of course, there are many ways we can craft situations or contextualize questions that would challenge, all right, their beliefs and even their type of decision making and even their type of choices. And we could also pick on probably some societal concerns or problems happening around us, or even in the nation, or even in the school, or even at home, where you could elicit, all right, or where you could gather responses that will make them really decide on something, okay? And not just about the decision, but actually helping them as well or encouraging them as well to propose, all right, solutions or even sound recommendations on how they can share to the solution of a pressing problem. So these are all but the instructor's role and points to consider when it comes to a learner-centered teaching. And we have here the third, and that's responsibility for learning. So learners in a learner-centered setup is not dependent on his or her teacher. Remember, there's an A there, not dependent, all right? So they depend not on the teacher to identify what needs to be learned, to prescribe the teaching methods, and finally to assess what and how they have learned. Look at that. Instead, they work on self-regulated learning, independent, autonomous learners who assume responsibility for their own learning. So, the responsibility for learning, therefore, in a learner-centered classroom is highly reliant on the learners themselves. Alright, so the teacher will not tell you this is what needs to be studied because it's part of the curriculum. Instead, you have to see yourself what you need. You have to assess, therefore, what you particularly need. And then at the end of the day, you also have to think of the process that fits you best and the strategy that would work for you in order to acquire the learnings from the materials you have chosen. All right, and then finally, when it comes to assessment, there will of course be a gauge or system, but as to whether you have learned something or not, that's for you to determine. All right, so you never can move to a level unless you be honest to yourself that you have acquired the right and the maximum competency in a previous learning. So that's it. That teaches you, that's the reason why there's what we call self-regulation. For so many times already, I have been telling about self-regulation, and this is what it exactly means. You are to become independent, and in your independence should be your honesty to assume responsibility over your learning, whether you have really learned or you're halfway there, or you still need more effort to really fully learn about the material. All right? And then learners take this stance during formal educational encounters and on their own as learning occurs across their lifetimes. The beauty of this learner-centered setup is that it prepares, all right? It prepares us to become really independent individuals, because many of our encounters in the future or in latter ages would actually challenge, all right, our own, all right, ourselves, and that we really have to prove that we can stand on something and be able to do something out of our own. So they had to, because they as students will be lifelong learners. That's exactly what I'm trying to point. As early as you are in a learner setup, let's say you are in it, but of course you're not totally in it when it comes to your case. But the advantage that this point is trying to remind us is that since learning is lifelong, it's an unending process, then your advantage or your edge over those who are in the teacher-centered setup would be you are already able to manage yourselves better and even your encounters, since you have already been trained to really decide or to become responsible of your own learning as early on. Okay, so the skills they acquire and the awareness of themselves as learners that they develop during their formal educational experiences, look at this, will be used throughout the course of their professional and personal lives. That's the point I was just speaking about. So below are examples of the changed roles and responsibilities in the in the learner-centered classroom. So learners are active participants, all right? So this is what you do. Learners make decisions about what and how they will learn. So these are just but summary already of what have been discussed earlier or previously, all right? And so on and so forth. So what about learning? Definitely, learning is an active search for meaning by the learner. Look at that. You are the greatest actors in this process, and you actually make learning happen because you have to be, by all means, zealous about looking for it. And of course, constructing knowledge rather than possibly receiving it. You're actually not in a type of classroom like this when you really have to receive. We have no choice because we are not in a classroom setup where we could see each other warm bodies, but we are limited by distance, and so with other group mechanics for that matter. And so it's kind of teacher-centered teaching. You are actually currently experiencing a teacher-centered teaching. And you really have to passively receive the content or the knowledge shared to you because of the limitations. But if you are in a learner-centered classroom, then definitely there will be more opportunities supposed to be to let you construct knowledge actively. And the fourth dimension is on purpose and process of assessment. So in a learner-centered course, along with summative assessments, one might also see multiple projects with self-assessment and reflection, self-tests, clickers for feedback about student understanding of concepts, etc. So assessment continuously provides feedback to learners. Again, the teacher is out of out of the picture when it comes to this process already in a purely learner-centered teaching. Because after the learner has had answered already the things that he or she needs to answer or the activities that he or she needs to accomplish, then there comes assessment types such as reflections, self-test. And these are by all means provided for the learner, and that only the learner has the responsibility to man or to manipulate. Okay? And again, honesty is very important here, and accountability. So what about the importance of assessment? The ability to self-assess accurately. All right, sophisticated learners know when they do or do not understand something. Definitely, again, honesty. When can you say that you're already ready for the next module maybe, or the next topic, or the next activity? And when would you say that you still need some, rereading or going through the material again? So they can review a performance and identify what needs improvement. You have the power to do that. What else do I need to improve on? Where else can I gain something? How can I better myself? How can I better my mark? How can I better my performance? They know when their lack of objectivity necessitates their soliciting external feedback. So let's say, for example, here, in the importance of assessment, let's say, for example, you tend to be dishonest or ashamed of accepting that you're actually still lacking on this area. But assessment would tell you then if one day you reach that point in a learner-centered phase, all right, and then you reach that point of not really being convinced, okay, about you giving such an assessment feedback for yourself, then you could actually solicit or ask from external feedback, okay? How can you do that? You can ask a more knowledgeable other, and then you could validate whether you understand it right or correctly. And then if the other person, or if your MKO or the more knowledgeable other would tell, it seems like you miss this or that, then that could be a good way to do reassessment, to go back to the material again, and then later on, when you're able to grasp it, then that's the time you could actually provide a more objective assessment of yourself. They have mechanisms for its collections and methods of evaluating it and acting on it. So of course, with assessment, the learners would be able to, provide for themselves a certain system in which they could actually, compile, all right, ways or even strategies that at the end of the course would help them really evaluate themselves objectively. And the last dimension is the balance of power. So learner-centered teaching does not remove the power or authority of the teacher. Always remember that I have been telling you since the start. Rather, learners share some of the power in the classroom. Unlike an instructor-driven course, learners have the option to explore content outside the boundaries of what instructors have provided. They have opportunities to express alternative opinions and choose different ways to apply content. Learners even have some power to assist in making policies for the course. All right, so there is actually an equal share of power. While it may be true that the dominance goes to the learner when it comes to the responsibility on their learning, but when it comes to some other features of classroom management, then the teacher actually has equal share, such as the learners. All right, that is the reason why when it comes to decision making or even creating of rules and regulations in the classroom, it's important that the teacher opens it and makes it free before everyone in the classroom to share, suggest, and even recommend. And that's policy making, policy making activity. And instructional strategies and methods are used for what? All right. Well, they are used to manage time in flexible ways to match learner needs. Instructional strategies, from where are these rooting? From the teachers. Okay, so in that way, if instructional strategies and methods are used or have been chosen earlier before the start of the class, then there are many ways to make learning flexible and to adjust with time as it will be required. So include learning activities that are personally relevant to learners. Of course, having the decision as early on and having choices of strategies and methods before your table as a teacher would mean you already have much of the chance to choose later on which method would fit or match the learning activities that will definitely be relevant to your learners. Okay? And then give learners increasing responsibility for the learning process. Precisely. Here, when instructional strategies and methods are there, well specified, then there is in no way the possibility for learners to keep asking for considerations, for extensions, and so on and so forth, because it's clear even yet before you already have asked them to do activities, because there's already an existing method to follow. And then provide questions and tasks that stimulate learners' thinking beyond rote memorization. Definitely, rote memory is out of the vocabulary of learner-centered teaching. That's the reason why teachers are encouraged to create or even draft higher order thinking skills questions to stimulate, all right, the ability of the learners to reason or even to debate on something. All right? So help learners refine their understanding by using critical thinking skills. Of course, not only through HOTS questions, but even through activities or even games or drills that necessitate, of course, critical thinking, brainstorming, defense, stuff like that, okay? So support learners in developing and using effective learning strategies for each task. Of course, given your background of various strategies and methods, you could also be of help assisting a learner maybe if he or she is lacking of what the fitting strategy or method he or she could use or apply for himself. You could help him or her discover for himself, but you can actually recommend or suggest. And the last, of course, is include peer learning and peer teaching as part of the instructional method. Unfortunately, we can't do that, as I have been saying. But yeah, in a learner-centered teaching, this is the beauty of it. Peer learning could have been possible if we were on site, seeing each other, even peer teaching. However, we are limited. But in case of learner-centered teaching, peer learning is possible. We can devise dyads or groups in two, or even go beyond that. Or we can always assign someone to look after one in the classroom and even during activities so that nobody is left behind. So here are the 5 dimensions of learner-centered teaching. For your, reflections, you may consider this one. So with all the discussions presented, this section calls on how well you reflect on the learnings you acquired on the dimensions of learning. You can do this actually in your highlights, in your insights, or even in the 3 points that you have learned. All right, so there you go. You read it for yourself, and that's it for our 3rd lesson, our 3rd video lecture. Thank you for listening, and I hope you guys have understood something. Goodbye.